you look at where the UK was in 2015, it was ahead of Europe in its consumer oversight of the broadband economy, and the EU rules brought it backwards. Today, the net neutrality policy is costing the UK at least £340 million a year.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh. I'm the head of public policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question: what's wrong with net neutrality? Neutrality is the principle that internet service providers should treat all web traffic equally by not blocking, slowing down, or speeding up any type of content or service. Now, its advocates claim it's necessary to maintain an open internet with low barriers to entry for new innovative web services. But a growing chorus of critics claim that these rules are both unnecessary and undermine digital innovation and infrastructure investment. To discuss this topic, I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Roslyn Layton, who is a PhD fellow at Aalborg University, Senior Vice President at Strand Consult, and a senior contributor at Forbes. She has an extensive background in tech policy, and in fact wrote her PhD thesis on net neutrality. So definitely the right person to be speaking to here today. Let's just get back to basics here, because I think net neutrality is quite a technical concept. What does it mean? What is the best way of kind of explaining what net neutrality requires of ISPs, of our internet service providers?
Matthew, thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to be with you and thrilled to talk about this topic. And it's important because Ofcom, the UK's telecom regulator, has put it on its agenda. They're looking at the evidence around the world and seeing that the UK could be doing better in broadband internet. It experienced through the pandemic that people were blocked because of the UK's net neutrality rules. 1 in 5 people in the UK are suffering a cost of living crisis. And these rules actually prevented the people who were locked down at home, their children, to study online for free, to access free online education. So that was probably the first huge casualty of this policy.
Yeah, this is the zero rating idea that if you have to treat all content equally, it means you can't be biased in favor of certain types of content. So an ISP could not, when you run out of your data allowance, continue providing you access to educational content or to government websites or to any other essential services. Even if the ISP wants to give you that service for free, it's not legal for them to do so. I think was EE, British Telecom, who raised some specific issues with Ofcom. And I think they were given a bit of a nudge, wink, wink, and allowed to do it in the short run. But certainly they're not meant to be giving you, unless, I think the rules get very complex, so unless they give everyone free access to all kinds of resources, so it's not biased in favor of some websites and other ones, but that gets very messy.
So, well, in any case, Ofcom deserves applause and commendation because they suspended the rules during the pandemic, as did most countries around the world, because all the governments wanted to be able to get citizens and people, they wanted to get them health information, free online access for education, for work, for other things like that. And that was very important. So we've had an opportunity to examine countries with these rules and countries without these rules, and they've certainly hurt people in the UK. And going forward, Ofcom is proposing to at least make this availability for obvious things like education and social care. But to get back to your question, what is this regulation doing? And it's basically going against the consumer choice and consumer freedom. People have value things differently. They may want to see different kinds of content. They may value different applications and services differently. But the rules essentially require all internet data to be priced uniformly and all of it to be treated in traffic uniformly. Now, that might sound, for some people, that sounds like equality, but it isn't, because we know that there are some things which are socially valuable, like health, employment information, news information, things like that. And then there are things that are discretionary, like entertainment. So this policy has been promoted by primarily the United States technology companies, entertainment streamers, because they wanted to have their data get a preference in terms of pricing and traffic management. And because they comprise 80% of the data, they have been very successful to implement this policy in a number of places under the guise that was consumer friendly. but it has not been consumer friendly. We can see, for example, the United States had these rules for 2 years. They removed them because the investment in networks fell, and also the programs which were needed, people wanted to have free data programs, they were being blocked. So, so importantly, we've seen that the United States did an experiment, it didn't work, so they removed the rules. That's 5 years ago. The prices have fallen in US, the competition has increased, and the digital divide has closed.
Yeah, so let's unpack the argument for net neutrality.
Yes,
because I think it's quite intellectually interesting. And I for additional background, I recently did a paper for the IEA on this topic as well, looking at kind of the UK's particular context when it comes to net neutrality, where which we can get to a bit more discussion in a moment. But the central argument behind net neutrality, particularly developing out of the US, is you have these American cable providers, and they're effective monopolists, because at least at the time these arguments are coming around, there wasn't a lot of other choice for broadband. You didn't have mobile broadband in the same way you do today. You didn't have people laying fiber. You didn't, in the US context, you didn't have something like OpenReach, where you can get a bunch of different providers using the same copper line. You just had one provider. And there was this, I think, quite conceptually consistent concern that in the context of their market power, where you're the one cable provider, you might be tempted to do something nefarious. You might be tempted to, if you're AOL, just boost AOL Time Warner content and slow down other content, and ensure that for the benefit of your business. Or if you're BT, you might want to promote BT services over someone else's, kind of have a kind of closed wall, start potentially start creating different consumer packages where certain things are slowed down. You end up with a risk that they could use this for political purposes as well, where an ISP might say, we want to block certain conservative material or progressive material, something like that. So I think there's a lot of kind of dystopian theory that these things could happen, but in practice, it's never quite been the case, despite not having net neutrality, formal net neutrality rules.
Yes, well, and you've made so many great points there. You're talking about going back to Tim Wu, who wrote this article in 2003. Remember, the prevailing broadband speed was 3 to 6 megabits per second. And, today we have gigabit speeds. So the technology is not an issue anymore. The capability of networks is far greater. But what Tim Wu was getting at was he was concerned that, BT was going to, block BBC or something like that. Now, any economist will tell you, if you do that, you lower the value of your network, and your subscribers will not want to subscribe to you, and you will just switch to another provider. Now, initially, Ofcom and all of the European regulators said, there's no reason for this policy because we already have very good competition in Europe. We don't need it. We have other things in place. And so, they resisted this for a long time and felt it was a US problem. However, essentially it was the advocacy of the American tech companies and the various parties who they fund, different activists and so on, they succeeded to do it because they realized the policy could be subverted to fulfill their corporate goals, which was essentially to achieve sort of discounts on internet access or free transit. Essentially what the policy is doing today, which, those of us in the policy field are showing, is it is blocking the competition from the upstarts to Google and Netflix and so forth. There are those who would like to use the network capabilities to compete, and they're not being able to access the quality of service capabilities or the guaranteed delivery or latency or all the things that modern networks can do today, which they're willing to pay for to improve their delivery, to improve the quality and so on. That's essentially illegal. And so from the point of view of the established players don't want upstarts to be able to buy that capability because they already have an established position, which they have, so they don't want to let others into the, into the ecosystem in that way.
Yeah, so what's quite intriguing about this is the ideal of net neutrality, everyone is treated equally no matter who you are in terms of a content provider, has always been a bit mythic, because different content providers have had different access to networks. So if you're a Google or an Amazon any other kind of Microsoft, a major company, you pretty much already have pretty express access to ISPs, to those networks. And you're not paying necessarily the same amount that you might pay without net neutrality, but you're paying something just to physically locate, maybe co-locate. Netflix famously co-locates a lot of additional infrastructure within ISPs, and so they get express access because they've got scale, but no one else can really pay the ISPs in the same way or access the same way. And I think you unpack. I want to unpack the UK's history of this, because I think this is quite interesting, which is the UK did not have net neutrality until 2016, but there was this debate around 2010, 2011 about whether or not the UK should have net neutrality. Ofcom did an investigation and said, actually, because the UK has so much competition between ISPs, because of open reach, because you can choose different providers for your internet, it's not really necessary. The ISPs voluntarily entered certain codes where they said, no, we're not going to block or slow down our competitors' content. We're going to treat everyone equally. It was analysed in 2015 that system was pretty much 100% successful. There were no complaints or issues in the UK. And yet here in 2016, the EU comes and says, actually, we think net neutrality is really important, and effectively overrules what the previous policy position had been in the UK and says, we're going to have an EU-wide net neutrality policy. The UK will now have to follow this. Now, what's interesting is Ofcom, as you were getting at earlier, is in some of their guidance, some of their kind of non-legislative process is diverging a bit from how the EU chooses to interpret net neutrality. But I think there's a broader argument to be made about some of the benefits of getting rid of net neutrality altogether, or powering it back much further through legislative affairs. And I think a big argument around this is just the fact that the nature of the internet is changing. It's quite importantly, the way we're going to want to access networks in future will be different. There might be a real need to prioritize self-driving car information, for example, or emergency services that all use the internet. I wonder if you can talk a bit to that. What could be some of the applications of getting rid of net neutrality? What are some of the benefits for innovation, for new applications?
Yes. So there's a lot there. I want to make sure that we cover, if you look at where the UK was in 2015, it was ahead of Europe in terms of its in its consumer facing, its consumer oversight of the broadband economy, and the EU rules brought it backwards. So I want to get to that. But in terms of your point about next generation services, it's something I think that the UK government wants to prioritize going forward when it looks at green tech and advanced manufacturing, creative industries, and so on. And today, the net neutrality policy is costing the UK at least £340 million a year. And this has severely slowed the rollout of 5G networks, which are providing the capability for these next generation industries. You need the high-speed connectivity, the low latency, and so forth. And the UK is severely slowed in that. In fact, if we look around the world, no leading 5G nation has the sort of rules that the UK has. South Korea, Japan, and United States, and so on, that all have rolled out 5G at scale, and they're already actioning what we call the titanium economy. This is the small and medium-sized enterprises innovating with advanced manufacturing in the former Rust Belt areas. Exactly what UK wants to do, leveling up different parts of the country. So that connectivity is not there. It also hurts people in terms of social care. Even though UK has extensive telemedicine, the next level of that, which is going to do remote access, managing a bunch of vital signs through the day, remote surgeries, and so on, those are not available in the UK because of the lack of 5G. So it really does cost financially and socially because of the policy restricts the incentive to invest. It restricts the availability to make the offers in the marketplace. And fundamentally, if you talk about 5G, which is a smart network, net neutrality is sort of regulating a dump pipe. All data is being treated equally and it's being priced equally. So that is at odds with a modern network, which is fast, which is smart, which is efficient, which you need if you want to enable your green technologies, advanced sensing, you want autonomous vehicles, you want all sort of transportation solutions, and so on. So that is sort of the cost here, and that's quite real. But let me just say, importantly, for Ofcom's perspective, there is a broadband stakeholder group, which was made of the various industry players they developed over a period of years very advanced sort of key performance indicators, which they would publish and use to essentially ensure that the broadband access, the broadband performance was meeting, if not exceeding, the consumer expectation. Adopting the EU net neutrality rules obliterated that. It essentially got rid of all the things that the that the UK had architected that were in the benefit of consumers, and it put an EU framework on top of it, which was essentially designed to stop the sort of worst European nations, which went off the rails. And it wasn't designed to get the best performance. It was designed to manage the errant countries who, just wanted to do their own thing. And unfortunately, that was not what was best for UK. And I think today, 7 years hence, the proof is in the pudding. And looking back to see that the UK has suffered in investment, it is suffering in network rollout, and it's certainly suffering in the sort of the freedom of people and consumers to choose, the kinds of plans that they want. My own research in this, I've studied this in the university for many years. Most concerns me is now the lack of internet innovation in UK. Before these rules were implemented, the UK had a number of companies that were in the top 20 of internet companies globally. None are there in the top 20 today. They've fallen quite low. And so just because the ability to get the kind of quality of service and the advanced connectivity they need is not allowed to be sold. So innovators don't want to innovate. Broadband providers don't want to sell it. Consumers can't access it. So it's been really a shame, because historically the UK has had some of the leading scientists in internet technologies. It has been an early innovator in all manner of developing IP technologies, and kind of lost that edge. Now we can look in other fields where you don't have similar regulation. In the US, the UK has been quite an important innovator, but has really stagnated in the field of internet innovation.
Yeah. So, I mean, I see that. I think you can think about this, in my mind, at least from two angles, which is from a consumer angle, we get a bit less choice in terms of the kind of broadband we can access. We can't, for example, pay extra because we want faster gaming specifically on our package, or we can't pay less because we're willing to accept that some things might be a little bit slower. And when it comes to something like the metaverse or in future certain business applications, you're really going to need the ability to effectively, what economists would consider, price discriminate. If you are willing to pay more, there's no reason why somebody shouldn't be able to sell you a slightly better service. And that's kind of from a consumer perspective. But I think that the other key point of net neutrality is that just like newspapers are traditionally funded by consumers and by advertisers in a two-sided market, you could also have a two-sided market where not only do consumers pay for broadband, but also there's some kind of payment system for the big content providers who put a lot of the burdens onto network, the likes of Netflix.
It's quite ironic. I mean, if you look at Netflix today, they actually subsidize their low-tier service with advertising. And, they have various tiers. They have a premium service with a high definition, and then a low advertising supported service. That's illegal to do for broadband. And similarly, we should have an advertising supported broadband market, but this was precisely the goal of Google and the large ad platforms to support the policy, because they did not want to allow broadband providers to access the advertising market, because they wanted to capture that money for their own platforms. If you could imagine how valuable it would be to have advertising supported broadband, you could essentially be paid to watch shows or something like that, or you'd have a free broadband connection for that matter. So we essentially sell broadband today like it's sold in 1995, as if email was the only application. And of course, as you've just said, the internet has evolved tremendously in terms of the services and content available, but the business models to access the internet are essentially frozen in time because of this misguided EU regulation.
So I just want to deal with some of the concerns here. So I think some of the critics of net neutrality might say, well, this is really just ISPs who want to get more revenue and more profit for themselves. Should that really be the goal of government policy? On top of that, I think there's this concern that potentially ISPs become a blocker of innovation, that they overcharge for access by the likes of Netflix. Inevitably, that could be then passed on to consumers of Netflix, which, you know, we're also consumers of Netflix. Many of us are, or similar online applications. That the downstream effects of net neutrality are actually quite good and positive for innovation, and all these kind of terrible things, at least maybe not mass blocking of websites, but there could be a negative impact on consumers. Is that as something to worry about?
So all of the things that would be described in net neutrality, like a predatory pricing or refusal to supply or tying, all of that is garden variety antitrust and competition law. The UK authorities, Ofcom, and the competition authorities already have ample tools to address that if those things happen. It's not as if this is the only regulation that's on the table. There are dozens of regulations which already regulate this space, and net neutrality is on top of that, putting an additional price control. So that is unnecessary. It's anti-consumer in the sense that consumers are not allowed to access other things in the market that they would like. But in terms of the ISPs, for them, if you actually see the various regulations, the UK has perhaps the lowest mobile price in Europe. It has exceedingly low prices, and the last trend over 20 years is declining broadband prices, regardless of whether there's net neutrality rules in the country. This has to do with the competition. It has to do with the, also the competition with technology companies, the replacement of traditional revenue with using an online service. For example, we use WhatsApp instead of calling long distance. So there's tremendous competition, which has brought down the price for consumers. So it isn't about the, it has really very little to do with the ISPs. It's more about what the innovators need to be able to create the services, and then consumers to have the choice and the diversity of plans. If you go to a place like South Africa, there is far more innovation in the kinds of connectivity that you can buy than if you go to UK. So that's the real question here is, how can we make things better for consumers in the UK? There's a cost of living crisis. Ofcom has been looking at how to make the connectivity more affordable, more accessible, all of those things. And of course, the operators want to do it, but they're restricted because of the net neutrality regulation.
Well, so a bit of a good opportunity here, and of course, it's worth thinking about this as well from the government's perspective as a Brexit opportunity, because the UK now can diverge from the EU's net neutrality regulations and potentially become a European or world leader when it comes to handling these kind of issues. And it's certainly something that hopefully the government will be looking at in future. Thank you so much, Roslyn, for joining the IEA podcast. It's been an excellent conversation and some really thought-provoking ideas about net neutrality. For those who have been enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider or to the IEA's YouTube. And if you'd like to learn more about the IEA or support our research and publications, please do visit iea.org.uk.
Thank you, Matthew.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.